Welcome everyone to our February meeting. I'm hosting because Barry Isaacson is out of town and he is organized this rodeo. So I'm just doing the hosting. We're going to ask during the presentation that you mute your microphone if you're not making a comment. We don't want background noises coming in. And a real quick hint is that if you hold down your space bar, you can turn off the muting temporarily so you don't have to go hunting all over with your mouse. Today we have Don Levan, Michael Layne, and Steve Senft-Herrera, I hope that's right, presenting for us. After Don's presentation, we'll be breaking out into separate rooms for conversation, getting to know people. And then when we return, there'll be announcements. So if you have anything you want to announce during the break, just message me on the chat and I'll get you in there. So Don, are you ready?
Sure thing.
Great. So I'm going to introduce Don Levan, who's going to talk to us about tension. So take it away.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you guys again. I haven't been with this group in a long time and haven't been really in the FileMaker community all that much lately, although I did go to FMDiSC, and as a result of that, I've spoken at a couple of the groups recently, but it's really good to see many of you. It's nice to be here. I'm going to share my screen, make sure that you can see it before I start. Can you see my screen?
Looks good.
Great. So it's interesting doing these remote presentations because after Pause on Error, I was asked to speak at another group out on the West Coast, and I think several of you were there. So if you've been thinking about this or if you have insights, please feel free to join in and to share and let me know what you've been thinking in the interim. And I have to apologize for the background noise. I'm hoping you can't hear it, but we do have some construction going on out back. So the cool thing about working in FileMaker and being a developer and being a consultant or an in-house developer is that each of us are alchemists. You change things. You change ideas into action. You change ideas into value. And that's an amazing thing. It's something that wasn't really all that possible before the last, 20 years, 50 years, whatever it's been, but it's a relatively new phenomenon. And it's really very cool. But here's the thing, unless you are engaged in a passion project, you're doing this work for somebody. You're doing it for your customers if you're a consultant. You're doing it for your employers if you're an in-house person. And it doesn't come for free. Time, attention, and money are all on the line. And that means risk. And with risk, and actually at any point in the creative process comes tension. And the way you use that tension, you build it and you maintain it and you release it, has a really significant impact on the success of your sales and the success of your projects. And if you don't know what I mean when I say tension, go ahead, take a minute, take a deep breath, count in for 5 as you're inhaling, and then hold it for the count of 5. And then let it out. That feeling that you're feeling inside is tension. And it's there in any part of the creative process. I have been thinking about this for a long time. In New Year's Eve 2000, as the world was getting ready to shut down for the Y2K bug and trying to figure out whether it was going to be an issue, I journeyed with about 10 friends to the Fish 5-day festival in Big Cypress National Park in the Everglades. And just to get there was a process. There was a line of cars going down Interstate I-75 in Florida from Miami to this little reservation in the middle of the Everglades. And it was hours long and people were walking along in the cars. And the music over the several days really caught me. And the reason was the band Phish, Phish, used that tension in their music. They played on the audience's feelings, and they built the tension, and then they released it, and then they built it and released it. And I didn't understand for a long time that this was something that was intentional that they were doing, that they were aware of it and they were using it. And in music and in art, tension is part of the process. And if you think about really great movies like Gladiator versus other movies, so movies will build the tension intentionally, let the viewer sit with it, and then resolve it. And movies that, at least I consider it successful, often do that very successfully, as opposed to, if you think about some of the early Marvel films, my kids made me watch all of them, but like Iron Man and Captain America, the early ones, you never have any doubt as to who's going to win. You know what's going to happen. And so there's no tension there for me. And so it's not as successful. So as I've been thinking about this a lot, I've been thinking about somebody else that was masterful at building tension in the sales process. And so I'm going to play a video clip for you that comes from January 2007. And in it, you'll hear the audience get really excited, and they get very involved. And I want you to ask yourself, as you're listening to this, and it's about a minute 30 long, why is the audience responding this way? Why are they cheering? What's happening inside for them? So here you go. Oh wait, I think I need to make sure that I'm sharing my screen with the sound turned on. So one moment. Share sound is on. Okay. Here you go. So ask yourself, why do they cheer?
An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone.
So stop there for a minute. So tell me, somebody chime in. Why are they cheering?
He's solving problems.
Okay, he's solving problems. Why else are they cheering?
The expectation of what's to come.
Yes, the expectation of what's to come. It's part of the sales process. You are painting an expectation of what's to come. And, there's somebody else who asked the same question, why are they cheering? And that is Nancy Duarte. Nancy Duarte, who's written a number of books, or 2 books actually, Resonate and Slideology. Both are really great public speaking books. Looked at the structure of this presentation along with Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech and a couple of others. And she was looking to see whether there was a structure that she could discern that made presentations great. And what she found is that they all follow a very similar path. Both Steve Jobs' introduction of the iPhone and Martin Luther King's speech and a bunch of others follow this sparkline graph. And what happens is the speaker alternates in their presentation between what is and what can be. What is and what can be. So what is? Well, what is right now there's, most of the phones that were on the market had really small screens, crappy internet communication, lots of big clunky buttons, poor internet access, and not great music. What could be is a touch screen, capable, beautiful, full color phone that has, great internet and web browsing built in, audio built in, and all of this in one package. So he alternates back and forth between what is and what can be. And this is a really essential part of what's going on in the sales process. And it all involves tension, because I would submit to you that those gaps between what is and what can be is a place of tension and is a source of tension. And that if you are aware of that, you can use that in a responsible way, in a respectful way, to change things. And part of what you're doing in your work is changing things. So Carl Rogers, about 50 years ago, in a book called On Becoming a Person, formulated a theory of change that where people go from a process where they're pre-contemplative before they start thinking about changing, contemplating changing, make a determination to change, go through the change, and then accept it, and then follow on. And two researchers, Prochaska and Di Clemente, in about the last 10 years, took that a little bit further and followed on this model. And this graphic comes from their model. And if you think about somebody who's thinking about quitting smoking, you see there at the top left, I'm not planning to quit. And then I'm thinking about quitting, but I'm not sure. And then I'm planning to quit in the next month. And then I've quit for 24 hours. And then I've quit for more than 6 months. And then I've stopped for a week, and then, but I'm thinking about quitting again. And so there's a cycle here. And so people are going through that pre-contemplation, contemplation, decision, acceptance. And every spot along the way, there is tension. And so let's talk about how you build and use that tension when you're selling. So here's how I would suggest that it goes. You start out by telling a story. That story creates in the listener a vision of the better future. So just like David Knight said, Steve Jobs was telling a story. He starts off by talking about the marketplace and what's going on in it. And he starts, says, and today we're going to change the world for you. And it creates this vision of a better future. And that vision of a better future causes people to move a little bit and destabilizes them. So if you think about the way a sailboat moves across the water, the sail is an airfoil, and the wind comes and it creates high pressure on one side and low pressure on the other side, and the sail wants to move to equalize the pressure. It's the same thing with how salt goes through a membrane, how in osmosis. So that vision of the better creates tension. It creates an internal sense of something's not quite settled, and it creates forward motion. And so that forward motion helps people start to move. Now, that tension then either gets resolved by homeostasis or by the person making the change. Homeostasis is a term that comes from family therapy and from psychology. And often what happens when somebody is starting to change, they get really uncomfortable, or somebody in the system gets uncomfortable. And so you'll see this in the sales process, because what will happen is when somebody starts to get uncomfortable, it works like a set point on an old air conditioning system. For those of you that don't have Nests yet, the air conditioning systems, there's a set point in it. And as the mercury starts to heat up, it kicks it on. And then when it cools down, it turns it off. Well, it's the same thing in families and in systems. As somebody starts to go through a change process, somebody else will act out in some way to bring them back to where they were, because that change is uncomfortable. And so what often will happen is it takes time and repeated exposure to help somebody make that change. That's why that comic, in that circle goes that way, because you'll start to think about it. It takes a little bit of time. You start to move, but then you may pull back into the system and then go back to the old behavior and then have to think about it again and again. And all through this is tension. Seth Godin, the best-selling author, blogger, and podcaster who happens to live right here in my town. I don't know him, but I occasionally see him at the farmer's market. Talks about how tension and release is a necessary part of the marketing and sales process. He calls marketing and sales emotional labor that you are doing to encourage change. And that in order to make change happen, you have to actually build some tension to move people. And the way you do that is you start to tell people about the better. You tell the story about the better. And then you show up again and again and again until they make that decision on their own. Now, there's always a risk here when you're building tension in a sales process that you're being manipulative or you're being a guru in some way. So you want to be responsible and respectful. But change won't happen on its own. You have to help move it. And that's what you're doing in your sales process. So you come along and you tell a story. So I think last time I was with you all, a year or so ago, I told a story about a project I did at ADP where we wanted to put in place a new design system. And we knew that system was going to take a lot of resources to build, and we knew it was going to take, probably a year to pull off. And so we had to tell a story to the upper management about why this was going to be a good thing to do. And we had to tell it again and again and again for months until we were able to communicate the reason for it. And the story structure is a pretty good one to use. There's a person in a normal environment. There's something in their environment that changes. They face a conflict, and then you offer a way to get through that conflict. And I don't know about you guys, but in my work as a consultant, when I was doing a lot of FileMaker work, most of my clients were in some transition. They were going from being a mom and pop shop to an enterprise. They were going from 20 people to 50 people. And at each point, what they were doing before wasn't working. And so generally there was a process of getting to know them, learning about what was happening for them, really walking in their shoes, and then being able to formulate and tell a story of, if you make this change that we're proposing, you'll have this better. And that's scary, and it builds tension. I mean, if you think about what happens in the sales process, people are starting, if they reach out to you, they're starting with some awareness of pain. There's something happening that's not working for them. You present an option and they start to consider it. And there is a tension that builds up inside because the alchemy is not free. Time, attention, and money are all on the line. If they give the money and the attention and the time to you to make this change, they're taking it from something else. And so they start thinking about it. Eventually, maybe they get to a decision or a process. And the thing that's interesting though, is how quickly the satisfaction comes. With something like an iPhone, the satisfaction is almost immediate. With what we're doing, it takes a long time. So you have to build that tension and then figure out how through the process to hold it and use it. So I want to pause there for a minute before I talk about the next step. And I want to ask you, when you guys are going through this in your sales processes, who's feeling the tension? And what things can you do to intensify it, and what can you do to mitigate it? Because you want to build just enough. If you build too much, you're going to scare them away and it's never going to happen. And if you don't build any, think about trying to make a sale when your client is laying on the beach, sipping a pina colada with somebody fanning them. There's no tension, there's no anxiety, there's no sale, right? So think about it for a minute. In your clients, who's feeling the tension, and how can you use it?
I have a comment or a question, Don.
Yeah.
In the, usually in the initial meeting, most of that meeting consists of listening to the client.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously we need to transition into the sales portion of things where we offer that you know, the first thing off the top of your head, solutions to their problem. But it almost seems like your process is you go away and then you come back with solutions. Is that what happens with you?
So when I've done consulting, really early on, I made a decision that I wanted to take any concern about sort of what the fee was or how long this was going to take out of the discovery process. So I started early on. Any project, somebody would call me and say, what is this going to cost to fix? And I would say, I have no idea, but I offer a fixed bid, fixed cost discovery process where I'll come in and I'll spend a week with you. And it's never enough. The cost of it is never enough to totally cover my time. I look at it as a loss leader, or I did when I was doing consulting. I would look at it as a loss leader that if I spend that time, I get to know them, I earn their trust. They tell me everything that's going on, and then I can envision, what the whole world fix might be, and then we chunk it into small pieces. So I would start out by eliminating some of their tension, by removing that barrier, allowing them to talk to me about what's going on. And then they tell me their story and I hear what's going on and I start to see how I can make the difference. And then I would present what I think are the solutions. And again, in that sales process, generally, these problems aren't easy to fix or they wouldn't be calling us. And so generally there's some price tag attached to it that's generally, has real weight to it. And so that brings back tension again. And you want to, you want the tension to be there because without it, they're not going to want to make the change, but you don't want it to be so much that they don't want to make the change. It's just, does that making sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Randy and I have done a similar thing with our clients. It's usually later. It's this whole idea that the moment they call us, it's not their problem anymore. It's ours. And they call us and, they give us their problem. And at that moment, their problem goes away because we're going to solve it.
So that's a really good point. That brings me to my next thought, which is what happens in the development process. So if this is the ideal thing where when you buy an iPhone, you have that awareness of pain, you make your decision, you get almost immediate satisfaction. In our world, what happens is they have the awareness of pain, they make the consideration, they make a decision and a purchase, and then it takes a long time before they get satisfaction. And who's got the tension now? Well, they have it because they've given us the money and they're wondering when it's going to get resolved. We have it because we've promised some better state for them that we have to deliver on, right? And so then you get into the development process and there's tension. And so a long time ago at the foundation of IDEO and the beginning of design thinking, Tim Brown coined this time confidence curve. Tim Brown, the former CEO of IDEO, maybe still, I'm not sure. And on the left is confidence and on the bottom is time. And he said, at the beginning of any project, you start out highly confident and very sure this is going to work. And then you start to get into it and your confidence drips way down and you're not sure, how you're going to work your way through it, particularly if it's a creative act, right? And there's failure involved and unsure, and you're not sure how it's going to happen. And in practice, it feels like this. You start out, you think you're going to skateboard across the Evel Knievel style across the gap. And in the middle of it, you fall into it. And you're not sure how the hell I'm ever going to get out of this thing. And slowly you crawl your way out. And then it starts to get better. So your client has tension. You have tension. Your developers have tension. And that tension, like I said, is both really positive. It moves things forward. But it can also really cause anxiety. And what you're looking for is a state of flow, a shared state of flow between you and your teammates and your customer. Flow being that state, where time stops and thought stops that is said to happen when you're doing something that's at the upper third of your ability level that requires all your concentration and but isn't so hard that it overwhelms your ability to think. And so ideally what we want in these cases in our development process is, where there's tension that starts to move everybody forward, but you manage it in such a way that it keeps everybody moving, but also okay. So how do you do that? Well, one of the ways you do that is with rituals and practices. The last 5 years, I've worked mostly in enterprise places, and we are very heavily using agile practices. And it doesn't really matter what you're doing. What matters is that you come back to your client with regular short feedback cycles, because the longer you go away without feedback, they don't know what's happening. They project and they worry that it's out of control, and you're like, ready to come back to them and think, hey, I'm a champion, look what I've built for you. And if it's not right, then they feel tension. And so, the way you want to try to mitigate this tension in the development process is as much as you can, start off with a short, you've got your big thing where you're going to build, but break it into a month or 2 months or something really manageable. Or even we do 2-week cycles at my work. And so we'll, carve out what our goal is for the next 3 months. And we break it into 6 2-week cycles. And then, every one of those cycles starts off with a planning session, a kickoff where we get everybody on the same page, the customers and the stakeholders and the development team. And then we go away for a few days, maybe a week or 2 weeks, and then we very quickly demo what we've done back to the stakeholders. And then we release it and we write release notes and we share those. And it's incumbent on us to really over communicate. And it's incumbent upon us to do that both for our customers, for our stakeholders, but also for our development team, whoever we're working with. When I was consulting, I had 3 people I was working with. I know some people in this group have much larger shops and some of us are just 1. But either way, it's really important as often as you can to communicate back to your customers. I know when I'm in the enterprise that I'm working in right now, that if I go away with my team and we're working on something for 3 months and we release it, but I don't write a note that tells in clear, understandable language what we're doing and how it fits into the larger structure, my bosses feel like nothing's happening. It's like a tree falls in a forest and nobody hears it. So, and it's because there's time and attention and money on the line, and that means risk, and risk means tension. And you can mitigate it, but it's also an amazing thing because that the tension used well helps change things. It helps spur creativity. It helps move things forward. So I want to pause here again and ask you guys, I know in the development process, a lot of you are feeling it. So who is feeling it, first of all? Like, let's see if we can identify all the various types of people in this space that are feeling it.
I would say once you're in the development, once you're past sales and into development, I've got 3 primary parties here. 1, the customer.
Yep.
2, the consultant. And by that, I mean the point person, as opposed to the team members. And I would say each of those 3 parties is feeling a variety of tension. Customer is it going to work? Is it going to have a positive return on investment? Consultant is like, am I going to look good? Is the customer going to be easy to work with or difficult? Are they going to try and micromanage the coding process as opposed to providing the specifications? And the team members are, I don't know, I'm sure they're feeling something.
Yeah. Well, what do you think that they're feeling?
think. If I was a team member, what would I be feeling? You know, you'd probably want to be wanting to make sure that the code that you were writing was something you could be proud of. You have an investment in the project being a success. Everybody on the deployment side, besides getting paid, you want to have successful projects for sure. You know, personal pride and reputational risk and stuff like that.
Yeah. So what would intensify it? In this process, how could you intensify the feeling of tension for the customer?
I'd say keep them in the dark. I mean, one of the things that we do, because we've been in this situation quite frequently where we're building a system. We've built systems before. We have lots of things that have, you know, more often succeeded than not. You know, every now and then you got something that just can't get done for a variety of reasons outside your control. But most of the time we've been there, done that. So we try and assure the customer that we've been there, done that by pointing to past successes. And we also provide a framework of communication indicating that we know that we're doing. And that seems to assuage, or whatever the word is, assuage the customer that, you know, there will indeed be, upon completion, the return on investment, because often the return on investment only arrives at the completion of the project, you know, because sometimes you just can't deploy till it's done to some great degree. So that's what we do for the customer. That's what we do. I'm curious what other people do.
Well, at the customer, some of the people I see feeling the most tension or the most uncomfortable feelings are the people who are responsible for testing what you deploy. They're asked to take time out of their day and experience this unfamiliar software and then give you structured feedback. And this is where most projects seem to stumble, is that I don't know if you know, expectations aren't managed properly, that this is going to take hours out of people's days and they have to commit to it. But then that feeling of, you know, I've deployed it, I haven't heard anything, what's the next step kind of thing. So you have to kind of, you can't relieve them of that tension because they need that to motivate them to do the testing. But you can, you know, try to, I don't know, be there with them or whatever. So I'm interested in hearing other people's solutions to that.
It's a really interesting point. And I want to just add on to what you were saying to suggest that the people who are not involved in the development process, but are asked to take the change, also end up feeling a lot of tension. And you need to think about what they're feeling and how to mitigate it. So, you know, the customers who all of a sudden come in one day and, you know, get an email that something has changed, or the people in your companies that you're working for, you're going to be adding a new module or changing the workflow. Like, how does that impact them?
I think a lot of what you just showed Steve Jobs, and he laid the tension out by talking about what's coming, but he allowed the audience to have the imagination of what was going to be delivered shortly, right? So the imagination is a thing. One of the things that we try to do is to lower the tension because it happens on its own. As time comes by, tension rises. You know, as costs increase, tension rises. As changes to my work rise, tension rises. So we try to try to get our customers to visualize. Let's not talk about money right now. Pretend this is free. What does the ultimate system look like? Let's talk about what that is. Let's not talk about time. Let's pretend you're already in this application and all of these things are being done for you. So, you know, to some extent, when you have a customer where you're laying out these things and it hasn't happened yet, we try to pull, you know, the relevant people into a little pod and go, hey, this app is going to work. It's going to do all the things that we intended. We're not there yet, but imagine what it's going to be like. And now let's talk about where we're at on that journey, because it does take time and you have to get buy-in at multiple points along the way. Totally.
And Seth Godin talks a lot about that in This Is Marketing, about how it's culture change. right? You're building the picture in the world. You're nurturing it. You're bringing them along for the ride. You're getting their enrollment, seeking and earning and keeping that enrollment is really important. Exactly right, Dave. What about the rest of you guys? What do you think about who else is feeling it as you're going through this?
Hey, I forgot to mention the users in my 3 parties.
Oh, yes.
The people whose lives will be directly impacted and might be terrified. With the awesome FileMaker platform increasing productivity, some users might be concerned that they would become redundant. So I always tell people that our goal is to double the business, not to cut the staff in half, and that we have to do it, or that this is a necessary aspect of being competitive in the increasingly automated workplace, that you have to basically automate things and grow your business as opposed to stand still and get crushed.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Dealing with their fear of change is really important, and is something that's hard. And you will have people, in an iPhone buying cycle, for example, you have the early adopters, and then you have the laggards. But when we're rolling something out, everybody gets it all at once often, and they don't get that choice. The people that would typically be the early adopters, and maybe there's a way to think about that. Can you bring in a small beta group to let them try it, and then identify the people that are anxious about it and let them try it early before it's really forced upon them?
You definitely need champions. We've had projects where there was resistance from staff, fear of impacts to their job, becoming, not, redundant, British for fired, I think. And what we've typically done is, explain that, we're doing what's necessary in keeping competitive in the business, and locate champions. Don, to your point, one of the things that's helped us a lot of times is the pivotal moment when one person who is a staff member and often thought well of by others says, hey, I remember specifically one person say, hey guys, it's easy. And all of a sudden everybody's using the system. So internal champions can often be a tipping point in user adoption, because you do have to have the users, they have to be happy too, not just the people writing the checks.
Yeah. So then to come back to the creative tension, how do you guys use that? Can you build the tension in a way that's helpful for your team? Like, what do you do for that? How do you bring your team along in a way that gets everybody thinking and moving forward? Dave, now I'm going to put you on the spot. When you were in the studio, how did the people that you were recording, what did they do to build creative tension that would bring their peers and everybody into the project together?
I think a lot of that, in general, you're walking into the studio, you've got songs you've been playing on the road, you've theoretically perfected them or whatever. I think it's one of those things like we see in any group of people. It's like, you go, hey, where are we going to eat today? Well, we're going to eat at this restaurant. And everybody kind of goes along. And then just about as you're ready to park, you go, I'm really trying to eat less meat, or I'm vegetarian or whatever. This place really isn't good for me. So in the studio, a lot of the times you'd have a song that had been played ad nauseum for years. And the bass player all of a sudden goes, I really never liked that bridge section. I really would like to kind of think about some changes here. And there are times when people ramrod right over. Nope, we're here. It's costing a lot of money to be here. Let's just do it the way we always have. But to get that tip in change, we've got to change this from what it is. It can be a very gentle thing. It can be a very abrupt thing. And it can be a somewhat hostile thing if not handled correctly. So there has to be, you have to have agents of change, right? People in the room who are welcoming it and can help chaperone that process so that everybody can contribute and get resolution on it. But it can be a sticky thing sometimes.
It can. I don't know if any of you all committed to watch the 8-hour documentary, The Get Back, the Beatles in the studio making that last album.
Oh yeah.
It was so good and so interesting, and it was so cool the way, they created a challenge for themselves. They artificially created tension by saying, in 3 weeks, we're going to have a new album, and we're going to have, all new songs on the album, and then we're going to do this movie for it. And it almost destroyed the band. Like in the middle of it, they broke up, and then they got back together, but they ended up with some amazing songs. And so that process, is managed well, creates the spark of life. It creates the creative inspiration, and can help move things forward. It can help change things. I encourage you to just think about it, pay attention for it, watch it, see how tension is manifesting in your projects in a way that's really helpful, and how you can nudge those things to get things moving forward, and where is it coming along that's becoming debilitating, and how can you manage that to make it better.
Don, one thing you're touching on here, and David touched on it as well, is that a big part of this is that in just about any team, there are inherent power imbalances. Someone's in charge, someone's low person on the totem pole or something like that. And part of managing this is managing the power imbalance. It's really easy to steamroll someone, in a lower position of power, especially if someone's obstinate or convinced they're right or whatever. And so to tease out all the good ideas, you really have to figure out how to work with those power imbalances and encourage the people who don't have any to, feel safe in presenting their thoughts and ideas.
Absolutely. You make a really good point. And it's actually why I use the word respectfully use tension at the beginning, because there is a power imbalance, and you risk becoming a guru or a manipulative sales shark, where you're using that tension in a really manipulative way, as opposed to, doing more emotional labor and letting them come to the change and enroll themselves.
I was thinking about the team, although I usually do solo development, is that I think part of it is matching the sense of urgency to what is the client. The client may want you to throw all your resources at it, in which case urgency is high. The client may want to spread out the project so they can finance it. And so their sense of urgency is less, but when you're working on it, you have to be present. So managing that tension on the team is probably pretty important.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Well, I just want to, go ahead, Len.
We're coming to the end of your.
I was going to say, I wanted to say thank you for having me.
Questions?
You can always follow up with me via email, or all the other social forums. I'm not as much in this community anymore, but I love coming back and talking to you guys, and that's why I keep coming to pause and showing up, because I really enjoy the group. So thank you, everybody, for having me.
Well, thank you, Don.
Great job, Don.
Excellent.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for being here. Okay, what have I done? All right, so we are going to take a break and go to breakout rooms. You're welcome to, I'm going to set that up right now. First, I'm going to pause. Okay, time for announcements. Does anyone have an announcement to make? Anyone? Got to know one of our first time attendees. Is there anyone else who is a first timer and would like to introduce themselves?
I'm a first timer, Ray D'Angelo. I'm from Rancho Santa Margarita, California, which is a little bit north of San Diego and a little bit south of Los Angeles.
So why haven't we seen you before, Ray?
My first time, I just got onto meetups.com and I typed up FileMaker and I said, you know, I need to get into this community. I've been developing FileMaker for quite some time, since version 5.5. So I thought, you know, this is the time. I'm thinking of maybe, you know, taking the plunge and doing my own consulting firm. Cool. I'm a full-time IT director at a company. I just rolled out a nice new FileMaker platform for them. And things are going very well. All that tension that we were talking about earlier is all gone.
Great. Well, we might tap you for a case study or something. I'm just wondering, because FMDiSC is more than 20 years old. Nice. And I was just wondering, how are we not reaching all these local-ish developers?
You know, it's funny you said something about a case study. I'm actually writing a case study for my school. I've made the mistake of jumping into a doctoral program, not knowing what I was getting myself into. So now I have I have new tensions now. It's all very well placed tensions that I have to turn in work and work through a very rigorous school project. But I will have a case study on this exact matter, the software implementation industry, and how it is a horrendous failure at about a 70% failure.
Ray, if you would put your email in the chat to me, I'll put you on the list. Okay, anyone else who'd like to talk about being a first timer? We love to get introductions. We love new people. Okay. Okay, in the absence, Michael, are you here?
I am.
Great.
And I am ready to
go. We have, Michael Layne is going to show us how he uses the data API and beyond. So take it away, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me get the screen situated here. And presentation. And all right. So first of all, can anyone or everyone see a slide on the, are we good with a slide?
It's great.
Okay. First, I am really excited and honored to be presenting to you all today. I've done a few presentations in the last few months, and I've really enjoyed it. So I love the opportunity to share what I'm working on, and to also to get some feedback and hear what other people are working on as well. There are a handful of slides. I know slides are not always something that people want to stare at during a presentation, but I've got a handful of slides, and I promise they're just to drive home some points about some security and some of the approaches that I took, and then we'll get straight into a demo, and we're going to be looking at a lot of FileMaker and a lot of not FileMaker. So this is me. So what we're going to cover is getting from a really large, not giant, but a pretty good size FileMaker solution. They have up to a couple hundred different users across the country. And there's a small piece of what they do where they need to expose it to their clients, their customers. And what this company does is they manage fine art shipments around the world. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at behind the scenes, all that goes into creating a shipment in this system, and then what their clients can see about that shipment on the web, on their phone, on a browser. And it does not involve WebDirect. So we are going to start by looking at FileMaker. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at a PHP application with talking to the data API via a library that someone in the community has written, and there are lots of them. We can talk about that if anyone has any questions about that. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at Vue, which is a JavaScript framework that I'm sure some of you may know. Vue is in the same camp as React and Angular and things like that. We're going to look at a Vue app and how it talks to the data API. And then finally, I can't see it because of my window, but I know it's over there somewhere. We're going to be looking at Vue and not the data API. So you can, if you hang around to the end, you'll see the results of that. So we're going to look at FileMaker for the flow of managing a shipment. We're going to look at access and how that works. We'll talk about security. We'll look at the web application. We'll definitely look at some code. And we're also something that bugs me and anyone who does web development and has to deal with FileMaker is the whole table name, double colon, field name thing. That actually in most programming languages, those double colons represent a static class. And so languages usually don't like that. And there are different ways of dealing with that. And I'm gonna walk through a couple of them. By the way, if anyone has any questions while I'm speaking, by all means, let me know. I'm not sure I'm going to be looking for questions, but I guess Lynn, you can tell me if I need to answer any. So why? So I've always had one foot firmly in FileMaker development, one foot firmly in web development, and so I've always felt like there was a time for one, a time for another. So we're taking this to the browser because it's just a lot easier for external users to get to data. I also think that when you switch languages or when you look at something like the web, you tend to make things a little more simple than when you're in FileMaker building really, really dense layouts with a lot of data, dense screens, and for power users. And why not WebDirect? I'll just say about WebDirect is I personally have actually never used WebDirect, partly because of what I said earlier. I've just been doing web development for a long time. And so I know WebDirect has come a long way, and it's a really great tool for people to use, but not WebDirect. As far as I can tell, in my opinion, that there's more control, less hack. You get to use different technologies that are designed to work in a browser. And probably the biggest one for me is that, when you learn things outside of FileMaker, you just expand your skill set. And what I've learned over the years is that FileMaker has informed me about non-FileMaker technologies and vice versa. So this is the first slide we're going to look at. And I'm just going to, so I can see my screen, I'm going to get out of this for a second and minimize this window. I don't even know if you all can see that or not. And I'm going to go back. So I want to talk about security for just a moment and looking at this slide. So FileMaker has a built-in security model that we're all familiar with. And when it comes to the data API, you're allowing external users to come into FileMaker in a completely different way. So I was never a FileMaker security guru. I'm not, my name isn't Wim DeCord or Stephen Blackwell, but I have learned over the last few years about just how great the security model is in FileMaker. And you can get very, very granular, which really can be a real advantage to locking down things for external users of a browser. So on the left, you see the number of data tables there are in this solution. There are tables in an API file that sits in the middle. And the API file, by the way, is the only file that users connect to directly. There's a UI file for the system that we're about to see. There's an API file, so everything happens in a transaction. And then we have a really dumb data file that has nothing but data in it. Then, and then layouts, scripts, and field level access. So the left column represents the numbers of those data points. Then web, we only 14 tables are exposed to the web, which is 15%. The API tables, we only use one. Layouts is in very small portion of the total number of layouts, and those layouts are specific to serving the data API. And for those of you who haven't done a lot of web work, integration, custom web publishing, etc., it's a really good idea to use layouts that aren't part of your normal FileMaker user interface, because that can be really heavy if you only want something on the layout that's needed and required. And we'll also take a look at a layout that is specifically designed to use with the data API. Scripts is the only place that I usually never used scripts with the data API. But what I realized was there were some advantages to calling scripts, and those at the very bottom you see there are 3 scripts that are used out of 284. That's the login, set password, and check off PIN, because the system that we're about to look at happens to have 2-factor authentication kind of baked in. Field level access is the coolest part to me because it's something that I never really dove into with much consideration until this project, which originally started about three plus years ago. So we have very few tables. I'm sorry, very few fields that we're actually viewing, and they're read-only. And then there are actually 3 fields that can be edited by an end user, and that's only under certain circumstances. So you really can get real secure because of what FileMaker gives us out of the box. And this is just a quote that I try to remember when I'm doing any type of development, FileMaker or otherwise, but it just reminds me to make sure that I'm not doing anything that's unnecessary. And sometimes you find out that you can get more mileage out of just doing a few things well than cramming a bunch of data or a bunch of layout objects into something. So right now, I just want to review a couple things for those of you who may not be as familiar with software development outside of FileMaker. Any modern web application is going to have some piece or part of this. And what I'm going to be showing is something that uses the CSS framework, which is basically our presentation layer. And those list of frameworks, that's just an example of very common CSS frameworks that are used out in the wild. Bootstrap is probably by far the most popular. There's Material by Google. Foundation is another one. Bulma is bold because that happens to be the framework that I'm using in one of the applications that we're going to view. Tailwind is a utility for a CSS framework that's really, really cool, but I haven't had a chance to use it much yet. And then in the middle column, we have the JavaScript front-end frameworks we've talked about. React is, as far as I can tell, React is probably the most popular among FileMaker developers. I think part of that is because of maybe Todd Geist and a few others that have really led the charge and in kind of getting web development just reaching outside of FileMaker for that. And it's really popular. I happen to land on Vue, which is definitely one of the big 3. I just grokked it. It was the quickest, easiest way for me to start to make progress and build real applications. So I encourage you to look at all of those. Angular is very enterprise, so I would not start with Angular, but I would look at React or Vue or Svelte, and there's a bunch of others. And then on the far right, we've got some back-end frameworks, and those things listed are all running on Node. And I think we all are familiar with Node, at least to some degree. Current versions of FileMaker Server are using Node. There are lots of applications that FileMaker developers leverage that are based on Node, like Auto, for example. And so this is a slide just to show that even though we have 3 rather different technologies, we can pretty much do the same thing in all 3 of them. So on the far left, we've got a code snippet that is in JavaScript, and that is a JavaScript code snippet that actually looks up and grabs an object from an Amazon Web Services S3 bucket. In the middle, we're doing the exact same thing. We're getting an object from an S3 bucket, just using insert from URL, and I'll let your imagination go with what else would be required there. And then on the far right, we're doing the same thing. It's just a different language. And you could add Go or Python or Ruby or all kinds of things. And I think this is important to remember that it kind of doesn't matter too much what language you're using, because you can probably achieve the same thing. And with that, and actually the system that we're going to look at uses all 3 of these. And now I'm going to get into the demo. So let me minimize this. And I'm going to open FileMaker somewhere. There we go. Let me actually, I had this open and I forgot to close it. So I'm going to close all of this and we're going to log right back in. So just a quick test. My screen just slid to the other direction. Can we still see my my screen? I hope.
Yep, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. So, all right. So this is the solution called ArtWise. It's this management system for managing shipments for clients of artwork all over the world. We're not going to go too much into this. Just know that this manages clients in different types of organizations, business partners, all kinds of contacts in all different ways, internal and external. They've got projects, shipments, proposals, and a bunch of other stuff. But we're going to jump right into a shipment. So I'm going to select the shipment that I've bookmarked. And what you're looking at now is a really busy FileMaker layout. And I'm sure we've all seen layouts that are even worse than this or busier than this. But this is everything they need to know about a shipment. And when I look at this and see all the things that are going on, you don't have to know every bit of this layout. Just know that the users were very involved in the process of designing all this, and this makes sense to people that do this all day, every day. So we are going to look at this shipment. We've got the shipment name. We've got a date. I'm looking at a very old record, but it's got everything we need for a quality demonstration. And then in any shipment, there are three primary, what they refer to as players. There's a shipper, there's an agent, and there's a consignee. The shipper is who's shipping the artwork. The agent is someone in the middle that's going to pick up they're going to make sure that the painting and the courier gets picked up in Paris and taken to the museum. In this case, it's the Musée du Petit Palais in Paris. And then the whole process reverses if the artwork comes back to the Metropolitan. So these players are really important. We've got some notes, we've got some activities. Some of this data is me just freewheeling, typing stuff in. So, you know, pressure washing, cut and stack, those are I've just made up things. And before I look at the people here, I'm going to point to that in a moment, but I'm just going to quickly go through these tabs. So this is the general tab about the shipment. Then if it's an air shipment, we've got some flight information. We've also got information about other things related to the shipment, airway bill. There's all kinds of things to do with crates and all that. Field operations are internal people that are going to be handling the shipment on the US side, in this case at JFK. Then we've got crates. In this case, there are 3 crates that are attached to the shipment. They've all got weights. They're all tied to contents. But this math is all important in here, and we can switch back and forth between inches and centimeters. And then we've got a trucking tab. So there's got to be a truck that's going to pick this up at maybe a warehouse or a museum. So trucking is also something that is tightly managed. We can even attach certain crates to certain trucks. We've got the contents of the shipment. This is the actual artwork. We've got couriers. These are external people that may accompany, and there's some test data in here, but sometimes the painting is worth a lot of money and it's really important, and they actually send a courier to accompany the artwork to the destination, and then they'll turn around in a couple of days and come home. Then we've got a handful of documents that are shared. These are all internal. They can drag and drop, and these are mostly PDFs, but they can be a variety of things. And notice we can share some of these documents, and we're gonna do that in a bit. Finance tab doesn't matter. This doesn't matter. I'm gonna jump back to general. So referring back to security, you'll see that we have a lot of people associated with this shipment. These are internal people, external people, people that are associated with different clients, whether they send an estimate to them or they actually are doing the shipment with them. And any of these people first of all, they can't log in unless their primary contact record is actually has the role of someone who can access the application via the web. And then beyond that, they have to be added to the shipment. And beyond that, they have to be given access. So I can turn people's access on and off right here. And then we always have a primary contact. But so we've got several levels of privileges before someone can actually see this. And with that, we're going to go and look at a shipment. So I'm going to change this date to yesterday. And for ease of use, if someone's in this system, they can either copy the URL and stick it in an email and send to a client, or they can, if they want to see it themselves, they can just open the shipment right from here. So I'm going to open the shipment. I just slid over to a browser. I'm going to log in, and notice I've got my ID of the shipment ready to go. So it should load that shipment right away. So the shipment is not found or unavailable. So I'm going to go back to FileMaker, and I don't know, you may have noticed I made the expiration date yesterday. So it's another way of them being able to lock down a shipment. If they don't want anyone to look at a shipment the day after it happens, or they don't want anyone to look at a shipment because it's still 2 or 3 weeks out or 6 months out, they can just get rid of this and it won't happen. So if I do put an expiration date, and I'll put today, I'll go back to my browser and I'll refresh, and there's the shipment. So now that we're looking at the shipment, hopefully you'll notice a few things that look familiar. It's a lot cleaner. There's a lot less information, but this is everything an end user needs to see about the shipment. We've got we know it's an export. We've got a special code that they use with another system, the departure date, the closeout date, and we've got our shipper, our agent, consignee. We've got the number of crates and contents, and we can actually select this to view the contents. And I'm going to go back for a moment. We've got our flights, and then we've got our contents, our couriers, activities, trucking, and no files. No shipment files are being shared right now. So the first thing that I'd like to point out by using a straight up browser talking to the data API is that you can do this. And so that's what it looks like on a phone. And this is important because the framework I'm using is responsive, as are most any frameworks these days, CSS frameworks. And this is something, unless I'm mistaken, this is not something that's not really available or works properly in WebDirect. But we've got something that's always, this menu hides as soon as you hit certain breakpoints, and as soon as we get certain, then we see our navigation pop back out again. You'll also notice that as soon as I get to these breakpoints, I have these anchor tags. So if you're on a phone and everything is vertical, you've got a lot more scrolling. So these only show up if it's on a mobile device. And if I hit couriers, it's going to just scroll down to where the couriers are. So that's one of several advantages that I see with using the data API and doing the shipment. So now that we've seen the shipment, and we can click and see that we've got another layout for couriers. This is everything that we need to know about a single courier. It's called a trip sheet. We can view crates. We can view contents. And I think what else can we do? And then we can view the schedule of everything that's going to happen on this ship. So let's take a look at how that's all coming through the data API. I'm going to use this lovely little thing called Postman, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with for testing APIs and doing some mockups and things. So I'm going to go ahead and send this again. So this is, don't worry about this too much, but this is our path to the application. And I'm grabbing this shipment, and I'm passing an ID of the shipment. I'm passing the user ID for some security things. And then I'm passing in the roles. And these roles are the roles that I have as an individual that just logged in. And these roles are going to help decide what I can see and what I cannot see. So once I make my query, and again, this is the query parameter. And if you use the I think it's called Execute Data API inside FileMaker as of, I guess, 18 or 19. You're going to be using this same sort of JSON for a payload to make a query. So what we get back is a lot of data. We get back something like 800 and something lines of data. And I'm going to walk through this briefly because it's all going to make sense in a bit. We get a lot of data about the shipment. That's the field level data. And then I'm going to assume that we all basically know what portal data is. And remember, we are referencing a layout here where these portals have to exist on the layout or it's not going to show up. So we've got activity roles, couriers, flights, field ops, cartage, which is kind of shipping, trucking, activities, files, parties, and then some other things. So we've got a lot of data coming through here. And one of the things that we could do to make this not so heavy and not so bloated and get data that we do not need is to get rid of some of this stuff. For example, portal data info, we don't need any of this. The shipment doesn't need anything, any metadata about this. So we want to get rid of that, and we probably want to get rid of a few other things that we don't need to display. The other thing we want to do is we want to get rid of this because this happens to be PHP, but in JavaScript as well, it is difficult to parse text out with these colons in it. So there's a way to get rid of the table names, and we're going to look at that for a moment. So now I'm going to run over to Sublime, which is a text editor. Sublime or VS Code is something that I use. Those are the two editors I use, and I'm guessing a bunch of you use VS Code or Sublime as well for any development outside of FileMaker. So we're not going to walk through a bunch of code, but we are going to look at this one. We've got a method here called get shipment. So we're getting a shipment. We're passing it some data. That data happens to be that JSON that you saw where it had the ID, the user ID, and whatnot. And so we call out our layout, which is REST shipment, and we're passing in some our database, our host, and some credentials. This is using a library that I'm happy to talk about after this or online after I finish. And then we basically send this query and we get the results. And here, FileMaker always gives everything back in an array. And if you're looking for one record, there's this one record here. So we get the response data, and then this is just telling PHP, hey, I just want the first record here. So our result is the first record in response data, which in this case is the only record. So this result gets us all this data. It takes 374 milliseconds, it's 37K. If I keep on refreshing it, you'll notice it's still, well, that's a lot faster, but it's 37K. It's not, it happens in an instant. You saw it in the browser, you saw it here, but we can get that down a little bit. And the way that I'm doing that here, and it can be done in PHP or JavaScript or Python or any which way, is I'm gonna comment my original result out, and I'm going to turn on all of this. So I came up with a method, and a lot of people probably have done similar, of cleaning up or sanitizing those table names. So the first thing I do, for example, for flights, I don't want the table names because I don't want to have to parse them. So I make a variable called flights, and I set it to my flight portal. Then I pass that to a function that I import called sanitize key, which is right here. We're not going to walk through this code, but if you glance at it, you'll probably get, yeah, this thing strips out the table name and it strips out those double colons. So that's what this little function is doing. And I do, and then after I have a cleaned flights, I unset, which is PHP's way of saying, hey, take this value out of this array. And I do that for flights, activities, activity roles, etc. Once I've done all that, I also remove that portal data info that we don't need. So I just unset it, which blows it away from my original array. Then the next thing I'm doing is I'm reassigning my result to, I'm building my own array. So I'm going to have shipments, flights, activities, activity roles, parties, and couriers. And then I return that result. So once I've done this, let me save this. We're going to go back to Postman and we're going to send this again. And you're going to see that the time is not too different, but we definitely have a smaller file size. It's probably 100 lines or so less. And as I roll up the field data, there's still some portal data because I didn't do this. This was mostly for demo purposes. So I didn't blow away every single thing, but the portal data is mostly ignored now. And after the portal data, you'll see that I've made flights a first-class citizen in my array. And there's activities, activity roles, and so on. And you'll notice for flights, no more table data, no more double colons. So we get these nice, easy to manage and easy to parse blocks of values that we can then put in our application. So these all become first-class citizens. The app is a little bit faster, it's a little bit lighter, and it's a lot easier to manipulate and present the data when it renders. And in showing this, I'm gonna jump to, so we're gonna pivot, and we are going to log into the same thing. And now that I've done that, we're gonna look at a view application which leverages those enhancements. So let's see. Yeah, so here we go. So I'm gonna, I've hard coded this to just pull up shipments for the space so I can quickly get to them. So notice these things look pretty similar. Let's load a shipment first. So this is a view single page application. This is PHP application, both getting data from the data API. You can see that, sure, they're mildly different, but for the most part, they're the same. They get the same thing across. If someone looked at one and then the other, they're probably not going to notice too much difference. I get the same benefits from doing this sort of thing. I didn't spend as much time on this one because for demo purposes, I just wanted to show that these frameworks give us all this out of the box. So you can see I can scroll through here. It's looking at all the same, exactly the same data. It's just, it's rendering it in a single page application. And I don't know if yeah, I do. I wasn't sure if I had built a trip sheet view, but I did. So view and PHP. Couple things about integration that we're going to walk through quickly is we've got some activities here, and activities is one of the few places where users can interact with the system. So if I jump into an activity, this is cut and stack in their notes. Someone can write a note, and this is for field ops. They can drag and drop images or click browse on their phone, and I'm going to drag an image here. And let's see, where's something. So what just happened is I think is super cool. It's not something that I did from scratch. I leveraged a bunch of other libraries, but what I just did was we used a JavaScript library called FilePond that allows you to manage drag and drop with all these things in a progress bar, and it looks really beautiful. And then in using that library to drag and drop an image onto the screen, I also uploaded it to an S3 bucket that is specific to this project. And that S3 bucket, these images are also tied to this particular shipment. So now I've got two images here. This one I uploaded before, the other one I just uploaded. I can view it like this. I can download the image, and I can also delete the image. I'm going to leave the image here for now because we are going to quickly jump back over to FileMaker, and we're going to go to that activity. And this is the detail of that activity. And I'm going to click, that may or may not work yet. So I just said, show me the files in this bucket. And it just, you'll see there was one there before and now there are two. So we reach up to S3, we see if there are any images attached to this shipment and this activity, and there are. So I know that they're there, but I know the names, and if I want to download them, if I want to see them, I can download the images themselves here, and then I can, of course, export them if I'd like. So that's some cool integration. If someone's back in the office and they want to know what happened, these images would be a pallet going through customs, or maybe a crate that was being loaded onto an aircraft. These are the types of images that are going to show up. And if they need to see them, they can. Otherwise, they just live in the cloud. And if any of these people were selected, then when that happens, these people will get an email notification that this activity happened, whether or not it was completed, and they will get these image attachments served from S3 into the body of the email. So that's kind of a cool feature, and it's also shows some great integration with AWS S3. Another thing that we do in terms of, excuse me, my wife let a stray cat in the house. Another thing we do with S3 is I'm going to run over to documents, and you notice we have some files here, and we've got a PDF that's sitting down here. I'm going to remind us that when I go to this shipment, you'll notice that there are no shipment files attached. But I'm going to go ahead and share. I want to share this. And for security reasons, this client did not want to share documents through the data API. There are a few reasons for that. I'm happy to talk through them if we want to or have time later, but they didn't want to do that. And so what we did was we thought, you know what, well, let's just extend that S3 integration. And so we're just sharing this document. So if I just click share, and in a heartbeat, if I refresh this, there's our PDF that just got shared. So it just went from FileMaker up to S3, and it's available for the app, and I can click on it and load it. I can also go back, and I'm going to unshare it. File was removed from S3 with our little toast, and then, excuse me. And then, so once again, there are no files there. The last thing that I want to show, and we're getting really close to the end of my presentation, is I'm going to go back to Postman for a minute. And I'm going to imagine that, remember the last piece of my slide, the last bit, we were looking at view, but then we were going to look at something else. Let's go ahead and load that in the browser. Let's see.
We're easy on time, Michael.
Okay, great. So if anyone has any questions, we can talk about things. So I'm looking at my view application right now, and remember, so I'm gonna click this V2 shipment. I'm gonna load that, and you'll notice that it's FileMaker 20. No, it's not FileMaker 20, but it is using a different backend. It's using MongoDB. What I did was I took all that disparate data from all the different tables made up from the shipment and all those related things that you saw in portals. And with MongoDB, all those things are in a single record. They're just nested arrays or nested objects. And so you'll probably notice this loads pretty quickly, but if we go take a look at Postman, we remember seeing these times and these sizes, and not all the data is here. But if I hit a different backend, which is a node server serving MongoDB, you'll notice that our times are, it's 5 milliseconds and it's 3K of data. And again, the data is not apples to apples comparison, but it's significantly faster. And as we all can guess, it scales quite a bit differently. So if we look at this data, we'll see that we've got, this is one single record. And the other thing is probably definitely 15 records or 20 records at least. So we have a shipper, and inside of that shipper, we have an address for that shipper. We have a name. Here's our agent, an agent address. Everything is nested. It's just JSON, which we're all hopefully becoming more and more familiar with as we have been working with FileMaker since 16, I believe. And down here we've got some nested arrays. So under contacts, we have several contacts here. So we have an array of contacts that's, that we can dig into and parse out, which is exactly what we're doing in this application. Then here are our flights. This is not a separate record. It's not a separate related record of flights. The flights are literally inside the shipment. So we've got, guess we've got one flight here, and we've got our arrival, our departure, and our airline information. And then there's some couriers. So just an example of looking at a vastly different database than FileMaker and how you can sort of turn things on its side. It even started making me think of storing data in JSON and fields in FileMaker. But I think we do have a little more time, I do want to show off one thing that I think is important, and that is within the view application. I'm going to go back to VS Code, and let's see. I'm going to open this, and right now we are looking at call it a layout or call it a component. Call this a layout. Is this shipment detail view? So this is the view, and it's just a bunch of HTML and using a framework. But you have rows and columns, and anyone that's done any web development, this is gonna look very familiar. And then we've just got JavaScript snippets in here. So this shipment detail, it's a few hundred lines long. We import some other services, some services and some components, and then we have a lot of other code here. But the thing I want to point out is that this shipment detail is this shipment, right? This is the layout. This shipment detail layout is loading this view. And we have flights right here. Flights is this card, this block with these two flights in it and this text. So in VS Code, I import something called a flights card. And so the flight information itself and everything that gets rendered and looping through those records to show this, it's not in this view. It's right here. We have a component called flights card, and I get the data from the data API. We have an array called flights, which we just looked at in Postman. And we also have a flight number that we pass, and then we have an airway bill that we get from the shipment record itself. So this component dynamically loads, and here's my flights card component, and it's 50 lines of code, and it doesn't even need to be that. So it's just a teeny little table, and we build our interface, and we loop through our flight records. And that's the data. And this is where we pass those values. We pass an array of flights, a string for a flight number, and a string for an airway bill. That ability to break things down into these small chunks of code, these little components, and be able to insert them in is probably one of my favorite things about doing development outside of FileMaker, is that you get to build these components that are reusable. I can take this flights card and I can stick it in anything else that needs a flight. All I need to do is pass it the data, and it will render. So I'm trying to think if there's, oh wait, excuse me 1 second. Let me just glance at my notes. Run app component tracking flights. Yep, I covered everything I wanted to cover, and I am actually let me see if I have any more slides left. I don't. So with that, I'll thank you all very, very much for your time. I hope I didn't talk too fast or too long. And I'm happy to answer any questions or not.
There's an awful lot of depth there that we didn't get into about which parts of the data API and the need to avoid web directs are working in each area of the solution.
Let me share a FileMaker layout, and one thing I did not do that I can do right now is to show the layout that we're accessing in FileMaker. So this is the data API, the API file, and I'm going to jump to REST shipment. So this is this REST shipment layout. This layout is the layout that everything we looked at in Postman when we were getting it straight from the data API, it all comes from this layout. This layout is based on the shipment, and it's got a lot of related records to it. This system uses the party model, so that comes into play. If we look at the graph right here, this bit right here, you can see the REST shipment. So probably most or all of these relationships in the graph here, these table occurrences, are required for what we get back in the data API, what we get back to the application itself. Does that help take you down one of the roads that you're referring to, Lynn?
Yeah, I guess what I kind of want to see is like a call to the API. What does that look like?
Yeah.
If it's easy to see.
Sure. Well, here's one right here. This, we're calling the API here. This is using Postman, which is something that a lot of people use to test things. My URL for my backend application is that I'm just getting the shipment, and it's a post, because for the data API, if you want to query something, it has to be a post as opposed to a get. Mm-hmm. And so the body of my post are these values. So I'm passing, and I'm going to take us hopefully closer to what you want to see when I look at the query that we build in PHP. So where I'm passing the ID of the shipment that I know I want, I'm passing the user ID so that I can do some validation on whether or not the user has access, and I also use those roles for that. So this query gets done, and then we get the data back. So now let's go look at calling that from the application itself, and that is going to be here. So let me just see if I can. Sorry, I'm trying to, the best way I've got to move my screen around because I don't know if you all can see it, but everyone's floating on top, and I'm trying to, all right. Excuse me. Let's go to this model. So this is calling the data API. When the data API first came out, I was super excited. I rolled my own code and library to go and fetch things through HTTP. And then a lot of people started to develop libraries, and there's a guy named Mark Denise, I think is how he pronounces his last name. He wrote a library called FMDiSC. And for those of you who used to use the PHP, the FileMaker PHP API, it's kind of a drag and drop. You have to change a few things, but it's very much based on that. I never used that library, but 90% of what I've done since we've had the data API has been using his library. So his library it gets imported. I create a new instance of that library with this. I'm calling the FM data API, and I'm passing it my database name, host name, username, and password. And these are all variables in my, so here are those credentials down here. You'll see a lot of different things because I've been testing against different servers and different environments. But these things get passed. Once they do, I set up PHP that is going to ultimately become JSON that gets thrown there. So there's a data array, a requests array, a query array, and this is just sort of the way you do it. It's a PHP way, but I promise you can sort of you can get there when you see what the results are. So my first query parameter is an ID, and that's the ID of the shipment. And this is the thing that I received from my query. So there's my ID. The next thing that happens is I figure out what today is, and then I have a field called expiration date, and I want to make sure that the expiration date is greater than or equal to today. Then after that, I'm going to look and see if 45 is in these roles, because if you're a manager, this is saying if 45 is one of the roles in that roles array, then don't worry about this. If it's not, and you're not a manager, then I'm going to make sure that you exist as a role and that you have access to the web application. So these are queries that happen based on those roles. Then I figure out what the layout name is, and all these things get built that become, they get passed to this library that becomes JSON. And so I finally pass my method called, and so this is the function that I'm using. There's a handful of them. One of them is API find records. You pass it a layout name and you pass it the data. And that data, in that data object is the query itself. So this is actually the part where I'm actually calling the data API. Is that helping us get closer?
Yeah, the interlocking of all these different technologies and apps is complicated to follow. Are there questions out there? There must be questions. This is all very interesting. Remember to unmute yourself if you'd like to talk.
You talked briefly about pushing data to MongoDB and then loading that into Vue. Can you dig into that a little more?
Well, sure. I just took data and I just wrote a script at some point and just created those records. So I actually opened up, since I thought someone might ask that. So what I can do is look at the MongoDB data itself. So this is this MongoDB database for this application, and I just have organizations, people, roles, and shipments. And then let's see, this is the actual shipment that we've been looking at. So this is the raw data, which actually MongoDB stores data in basically something that is akin to JSON. It's almost exactly JSON. So the way that this data is stored is for all intents and purposes exactly what we saw here. Let me see if I can raise that up a little bit. This is actually how the data is stored. It's just you just build a bunch of JSON and you throw it at MongoDB and it generates these records. Now the MongoDB structure itself, it's almost a whole nother session on that. But the data gets stored. You build your objects, and you build nested objects and nested arrays, and MongoDB just takes the data as it comes. There is no structure, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you throw at it. It's just a document. One document may have no flights in it. One document may have 10 flights in it. And it doesn't matter because it's not a SQL type database. I don't know if that answered your question or not. But.
Yeah, it does. But I guess I'm curious. Do you have the FileMaker database? Do you have some like a sync logic or a push routine set up that's connected to Mongo?
No, I did this strictly as a sort of a test case. I did this just to just really I wanted to compare apples to apples in terms of data and see what the performance difference was. So I don't have something that syncs back and forth. I took some data and I think I wrote some code that just created the records in MongoDB. If I think I might be able to pull up what I did that in though. That might help. Let me just see if I can get something here. So Postman wasn't really working for me for a long time. I don't know what the problem was. And so I used a tool called Insomnia, which is very similar. But I got a new laptop a few months ago and Postman started to work. And so that's what I used in this. But let me just take a look here and see. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. So this is me getting a shipment. It's the same shipment you just saw. We're just looking at something different. What I did was I created something. I created a shipment record. And then this is exactly what I did. So I used the patch verb and using the ID here, I wrote this JSON is flight data. And when I sent this, it just inserted that it inserted the flight data inside the shipment record. And so this is how I built it all. Is I don't see where I created the record, but these are all the things that I use to modify the records and add data to the records. So everything you see here, these are all bits and pieces that ended up building this. The other thing to go to is probably way outside of the scope of this, which is to show you the Node.js app that actually takes the data and writes it in. So I probably won't go there.
Okay, one last question. Anyone?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Oh, I was just going to ask if he was inserting the data into Mongo using that ID that I see at the top in the URL.
Yes, yeah, that ID. I mean, this is just hitting an API, and on the backside, I use that ID to update a record rather than create a new one. Yeah, I mean, it knows. I mean, the code in the back end that we're not seeing is the code that actually knows whether to create a new record, delete something out of a record, or add another nested array inside a record. So you could be looking at a shipment record that had nothing in it, or maybe a shipper and an address. And then if you want to add an agent to that record, you just build an agent object, and then you just, I'm using that that ID to update that. And once this gets posted, now that record has an agent in it.
Okay, so the ID is basically the database, and what you're doing is inserting these nested arrays inside of that database.
That's correct. Yeah, that ID that I'm highlighting here, the 60 ending in A5, that is the UUID of that record, and there it is right there. So this is looking at it in raw form. So MongoDB actually has a primary key underscore ID that's in every single record, period. There's nothing you can do about it. I mean, it is what it is. And so I'm just leveraging that. So I'm passing this, and then my code knows to go, and I'm using a JavaScript library to tell MongoDB to edit this record or to update this record.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Michael, for your time in preparation and your time in presenting. It's an amazing juggling act of all these technologies.
Well,
and the results are beautiful and useful, I'm sure, to the client. I do want to remind you, if any of those credentials you showed are current, you need to change them. This is going to be on a recording.
Yeah, understood. You know what? Everything that you saw is all in a local development environment.
Wonderful. Good to know.
Yeah.
Okay, Steve, are you ready?
I am ready. Yeah, just sort of finding the unmute button, as is often the case, right?
Okay.
Well, let me stop sharing. Thank you all very much for your time, by the way. I appreciate it. Thank you for the questions.
Okay. So, Steve, you can go ahead and share.
Okie doke.
There we go. We can see you.
Okay, great.
And Steve, now let me see if I get this right. Senft-Herrera.
Yeah, that's great.
Is going to talk about JSONQuery, which we heard something about last month from Kevin Frank and from Steve. And we're going to go into that in more depth today. So take it away.
Okay, no, thanks. So you just got the gist of what it is. We're actually taking a look at JSONQuery under the hood, which means, unlike last time where we looked at a lot of examples about what the function can do, the topic for today is more about what were some of the challenges that went into building it, what were some of the things that I was trying to solve, and how did I go about doing that. The usual obligatory, I'll just say customary things here. I'm Steve. I work at Beeswax Data Tools. Mark, I saw you might be here. Mark Scott, if you're in the audience, he's my buddy from Beeswax. Hi, Mark, if you're there. Questions, if you have questions, please feel free to interrupt as we go along. I think it would make for a more engaging presentation, personally. Same thing, if you notice that I'm using a font size that's too small, I tried to be generous enough when I made up these documents, but let me know and we can increase the size a little bit so that nobody has to feel like they're left out if you're on a small screen. Thanks to everyone at FMDiSC, in particular the folks who are responsible for getting me here today. I listed your names there, Jonathan, Barry, and Lynn. Thank you. So with JSONQuery, the overarching themes that I wanted to talk about today were how, there's this balance that you have to strike between wanting to have a really excellent product, wanting it to perform really well, and wanting it to be very maintainable. And JSONQuery, if you saw the demonstration last month, you know that it's an ambitious project. So the code is immense. And immediately that means you have to take extra measures to try to keep such a large code base maintainable. And at the same time, that plays into accuracy and excellence, because sometimes to make things look and work seamlessly on the outside, you have to go through some cumbersome steps on the inside. And so you not only have to fit that in there, but you have to fit that in there in a way that you can maintain it, and you have to fit that in there in a way where it's still going to perform well. So it's a fun game to try to build something like this and balance all of these three things. Additionally, we'll be touching upon just how the code evolved. It started with version 16 of FileMaker and then took a new leap in its code base at version 18. So that's what we're going to look at, and let's get started. So to talk a little bit about maintainability, let's just take a quick look at the code base to start with, and let's have a quick look at what the code looked like for the very first version of JSONQuery. You've got my header at the top. There's nothing there that's going to be mystical. In fact, there's nothing mystical in this whole thing. It's all built out of really basic components. It's just there's a lot of use of the same basic ideas over and over and over again. We've got this file here that is just under 30,000 characters. So it's fitting into the size limit. I'm not sure if you're aware, but there's a 30,000 character size limit for calculations, or at least for the custom function calculations. And I think that's calculations in general, but definitely for the custom functions. So how do you write something like this and keep it maintainable? You can see it goes on and on and on and on. And this is the first version, which is a very simple version relative to its successor.
Hey, Steve, is there any way you can make that bigger?
Absolutely. In fact, that was one of the things Lynn and I talked about, and I forgot to make that change. So thanks for calling it out. How's that looking?
Well, I'm still having trouble, but I don't know about anybody else.
Should I take it up one more notch? We're at 125%. Go to 150. We're going to do a lot.
Much better for me. I'm looking at your laptop screen inside a window on my laptop screen. So
okay, okay, we'll keep it at this. If people get tired of the scrolling, we might balance it, take it back one notch. But I do want people to be able to see it.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. Alrighty. So the question is, how do you keep something like this maintainable? And let's show you what it looks like in its current form. You'll see that it's a lot more readable at this point. We'll take it up to 150 as well here. You can see there's a lot more use of white space. I'm true to what I usually do, which is I have very long variable names that are very descriptive. So you can see is subroutine. I'll use that right here, you know, so I can have more English language sort of writing in my code. It's what helps me. And in fact, I should go back to like my list of things I wanted to talk about because we're getting into them and I'm sort of getting ahead of myself. The concept, one giant let statement. And by that, you know, we're using a let, but the idea with the let, right, when you first learned it, you realized that you didn't have to write convoluted code that would have all of this sort of nesting of cases and ifs and cases and variable references, or rather references to the same thing over and over again. Let really open the doors to allowing you to write code that was single line by single line by single line by single line. And that's what I'm talking about when I say one giant let statement. Of course, it's a let, but the idea is that as you look through the code, you should be able to look at any particular line and have it be readable on its own. And I know you're going to look at this and you're going to say, Steve, that doesn't look readable, but it actually is once you start working with the code. You can take any particular line and it should be a block, something like this, where you can look at this and you can say, okay, it's a case statement. I understand what I'm looking at here. Some sort of output is going to happen based on a certain state. And these variables are named in a way that if you're familiar with the code, it's helpful to let you know what's going on. Any statement that you hone in on should be able to do something like that. Here's another example here, just scrolling to something random in the code. So that's line by line in the case is what you're looking at. As I've mentioned a couple times now, the use of very long and descriptive variable names. And let's see what else I said here. Be generous with defining new component statements within the let. And by that, what I mean is sometimes, well, this is a good example right here. Actually, that's not a good example. By that, what I mean is you have, say, let's go back to this source right here. Let's redo a find I was doing earlier. I've defined this variable called isInitial. And isInitial is equal to this statement right here, determines whether or not the code's been called initially or not. Now, I could have used this chunk of code right here in this case statement, but I chose not to. That's just your basic, like, if you've watched Robert No's presentations, you learn that stuff. You don't do this when you could have done that. So that's one of the rules that, or it's not a rule because I'm the only one doing it. So it's just sort of one of my guidelines that I work by as I do this sort of code. So generous with defining the new components, long descriptive variable names, 90% consistent with indentation or better. I'm not sure. I'm just going to zoom out for a second and let you see that. You don't necessarily have to see the actual type. You can just sort of see the shape of it and you'll get a better sense of what I'm talking about. You can see the indentation. I wouldn't say it's rigorous, but it's admirable. You know, I've obviously taken the care to make sure that everything's indented so that I can look at something like this and really just grab it and read it as a function. And I know that's probably too small for you to see, but again, I'm just asking you to take a look at the shape of the code at this moment. Let's put it back.
Question, Steve.
Absolutely.
Yeah, when you're working, I imagine you're doing more of your editing in like BBEdit because it's a big window you can scroll and search and all that, and then you're copying and pasting into FileMaker and checking for errors. I was just curious about like how you round trip between FileMaker and BBEdit while you're making changes.
Very small iterations. So you're right, I do my work in BBEdit, and I basically make a small change. You know, this is post the initial block of code. The initial block of code, I can't even remember how I was doing that so many years ago. But at this point, the rule is make small changes and test them and try them out. The round trip involves something that we'll see a little bit later because I have to minify the code before I get it into FileMaker. But the rule that I follow is make small changes. Don't make 7 changes and then go and test it out and wonder where you broke something when something breaks. Make 1 change, 2 if you're ambitious, and then go and try them out. And most of the time that works just fine, actually. There are a few times, you know, sometimes you'll throw in an extra semicolon or something like that, but that's actually really easy to catch if you've just made 1 change. You know exactly where you were working. You can go in and you can find that let statement, get rid of that semicolon that you sometimes put in after the last statement that you shouldn't have, and it's a done deal. You've fixed it. So small iterations is basically the rule right there, and that's number 11 down here.
Great, makes sense.
I wanted to, I didn't want to let this pass, that you talked about the shape of the code. That's something that isn't often mentioned or contemplated, but it can be significant in locating yourself within long, complicated code. So just a thought.
Yeah, thanks for calling that out. I haven't really thought about it consciously, but yes, that's true. And that sort of leads me into a couple of the other things. I'm big on white space. That's down here somewhere under personal preferences, lots of white space. I have a convention where I put all of my constants denoted in uppercase. So like when I look at this code right here, immediately this jumps out at me. I know that variable is a constant. It was set once at the top of the file somewhere, and I'm not expecting it to change anywhere. And I would be surprised if I did find it somewhere that it was changed. So I know that I can go and find the definition for this up at the top as well as this. They sort of jump out at you when they're in uppercase. So I have my constants that way. I have indentation for shape. I have a lot of white space separating sections, and each block, as I mentioned, should be something that stands alone on its own so that you could hand this block, say, to an intermediate or maybe an even beginning developer and say, what is it doing? And, you know, of course, they can't tell you the giant context, but they can tell you the basics of what's going on in that particular function or in that particular, I call it a function because I'm thinking of it as a single unit, but it's of course one calculation within the giant piece. And to move on a little bit with that, you know, we talked about the shape. I'll give you the basic skeleton of what version 16 looked like, and let's put this at 150 as well. Okay, so the basic skeleton of the function for version 16, remember we did not have the while function. I needed iteration. So iteration came from having the function call itself. A lot of people call that recursion. I tend to call it self-invocation. I get a little bit picky with my terms there, but same thing we're talking about there. So after the comments, you've got the opening let. And the first thing that I do is I grab the input from the parameters of the custom function. Those parameters are never referenced within the code after these first few lines. I take them and I store them in variables. I define all of my constants. And then somewhere along the line, I define some sort of variable that determines why this function is being called. And when I say this function, I actually mean a particular iteration of the function. Why is it being called? Because there's going to be branching later on that takes it to either the main routine of the code or subroutines of the code. And we'll see that as I scroll down in just a minute. Actually, no, we'll see it right now. Right here, we're starting to see a case statement. This is also standard part of the skeleton. The case says, hey, am I the main branch? If so, I'm going to execute this right here, which is where you expect all of the business logic that you associate with your function is going to happen there. If it's not, it's going to go down to a subroutine function. And there can be many subroutine functions. In the first version 16, there was probably only 1 or 2. I needed subroutines to do some path processing. And by subroutine, I basically mean a supporting calculation that's not really part of the main calculation, but it's something that you need to do. It could be data cleanup. It could be some sort of special substitution, something like that. In the case of version 16, it was some path pre-processing that I was doing to the input. And I wanted that factored out into a separate function. And because I was in version 16, I also needed it to be factored out into a separate function because I was using the recursion or the self-invocation to get iteration out of the function. So that's the basic skeleton. Let's take a look at what it actually looked like in the code. You can see I've got my comment header. And then just as I said, I grab all of my parameter values that you can see here are written in the more pretty title case. I store them in variables, and then I never use these ever in the rest of the function. I define all of the constants that I'm going to need, and you can see they're all in my convention of uppercase. And then right here is the step where I determine if it's a subroutine or not. If it's a subroutine, I'll go down and the code will happen in a block towards the end of this file. Otherwise, it'll happen in this main section here, which is the body of JSONQuery happens in this right here. Questions so far? No? Okay. So the only thing that I think I didn't mention here that I would want to talk about is the domino rule. I call it the domino rule because those of you who play dominoes for points, it's been a long time since I've done it, but one of the first rules that I learned was if you can't use it, shut it down, which basically means if on your turn you're not about to be able to score some points for yourself, you change the nature of what's on the board so that the next player can't score those points that you weren't able to score either. You basically making it so that if you can't win, the next person's not going to win either. But the catchphrase for that when it was taught to me was, if you can't use it, shut it down. And that's something that I apply in the functions here. In fact, I'm staring at one right here. Check and see whether you really need to do the calculation. Before I do this calculation here, I know there are some cases where I don't necessarily need to do it. So if I had been a lazy person when I did this, not that I'm not, but if I had been a lazy person with respect to writing this right here, then I probably could have just written it without this case. And it would have been okay. I would have just gone ahead and calculated. But when you're talking about performance and doing things many times in iterations, you really do need to shut it down if you're not going to use it. And so you have protective clauses, and that's what this case statement was doing here. Basically, I'm not going to use this in certain cases, and I shut it down. I just return something really simple. That allows me to continue to have this sort of paradigm where I'm just doing line by line, statement equals something, without having to get into some sort of more complex nested case, or if where I only calculate this under certain circumstances. I basically just shunt it right here, and it makes for simple to read code. And it allows me to have this particular step not cost overhead and not add to the overhead many times if it doesn't apply. So that's the if you don't use it, or if you can't use it, shut it down rule. And that really is important when you're back in 16 writing the self-invoking functions, because the function calls itself again, and you might have a lot of setup that you do in your initial steps that you don't need to do time and time again with each iteration. So you can see, we looked at this variable earlier on called isInitial. Let's just take a look again where it was defined. Right here, it's basically seeing if it's the very first time that this function is being called. That is to say, it's iteration 0 or iteration 1, depending on how you want to look at it. That variable will be used repeatedly throughout this function, explicitly for the purpose of shutting it down if I'm not going to use it. If it's initial, I'm going to go ahead and do this calculation because I need to get the JSON in an escaped form. If it's not initial, it's not going to do it again. It's going to be passed and it's going to be reused. So you can see there's multiple uses of this, and it's basically shunting to allow myself to not incur overhead on second or further on iterations when I don't have to. Okie doke. So we covered like the basic things that I was doing for maintainability, and yet I'll be the first to admit this right here is not something that I would want to maintain. It eventually evolved into what I showed you a minute ago, something like this, which I'm actually really happy to maintain. We'll go again back to something where you can kind of see it again in shape. It's just basically a bunch of sections of code. And as long as you're comfortable with writing and reading and understanding sort of intermediate level FileMaker code, then you should be able to go in and edit any particular of these and just think of them as an individual function that's happening within the giant greater plan of the entire function. All right, so let's talk just for a moment about what changed when we went from version 16 to version 18. Of course, the while loop was introduced, and so it was no longer necessary for my code to call itself over and over again just in order to get iteration. So this change for me and this function, it was not about performance. The while didn't really speed up anything for me, but it certainly did help me keep the code smaller and simpler. One reason being, I no longer had to use the shut it down philosophy that I was just talking about a moment ago. It was no longer necessary because those variables that I was setting in the version 16 code over and over again and having to shunt each time, they were now only being set one time at the beginning of a while block. And so there was no need to write in the shunt. It was also easier because when you're doing the self-invoking code in version 16 or so, you have to pass along any data that you want to reuse. Say you've processed some sort of block and a lot of computational labor might have gone into processing that block. You don't want the next iteration to have to do that same computation again. So you pass it into the next iteration, as well as you're passing in state to the next iteration. And all of that was, the need to do any of that was taken away by the while as well. So the while was a giant blessing, but it wasn't about performance. It was about keeping the code simpler. And I loved it. Okay, still what I did though, even when we got to version 18, I was still doing self-invocation. I just was not doing it for the purpose of iteration. I was doing it for the purpose of recursion, and I was doing it for the purpose of the subroutines. And I showed you the subroutine example a little bit, or I talked about it a little bit. I don't think I actually showed you one. I can show you in a second. Let's take a look at what the skeleton looks like for version 18. Okay, so starts out very similar. We get our input, we define our constants, we define some sort of variable that's going to allow us to branch for subroutines, and then we do our branching. This is all the same as version 16. At this point, we've got our while statement. This is where it gets new. And it's basically what I was just speaking about. You get to define all of your variables that you need in here, and you no longer need to pass them in. So a lot of that domino strategies I mentioned right here, you don't have to do it. Set it once, edit them in here, and it's a standard while statement. The iteration rule, I generally use something very simple, so I didn't have to think very hard about this step. And then the meat of the code was all in this block here. The return section, I generally try to keep it to a basic case. There are still several cases that have to be considered, because you have to consider the case where there's been an error and you need to return an error message, or a case where there's some sort of other complex post-processing that has to happen to the result that the main block is calculated. And so that might have to happen in here. So it's not an absolutely simple case, but I do try to keep it just basically to a case. After that, we have our subroutines. Examples of subroutines in the version of 18 were about when I started adding in features that I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep, or that were requested, and they seemed sort of like add-ons. And so I wanted to keep the code modular and not have them entangled with any of the rest of my code. So if we take a look at the version 18 code, and again, we're looking at it in the big shape right now. I'm just going to go down towards the end, and I'm going to, in fact, just say begin subroutines. I think we're going to find it that way. So let's get to a reasonable size again. Oh, did I lose it when I did that? That's a shame. Let's try that again. There we go. All right, so we've ended that main while statement, and now we're into the land of subroutines, and each of these is basically just a branch in that giant case, and each of them performs a very specific task. I give myself a comment to tell myself how I'm expected to call this, and from there, it follows the same conventions that I use for writing any function, where I get the input, I set up my variables. In this case, it's a while, so I'm doing iteration. I'm able to reuse the constants that are defined at the very top of this file. And you'll just see each one of these, if I do a search for something like this, we're going to find each of the subroutines that I define. Each one starts with basically the input operator being a particular constant value. And so this is something here that does escaping for me. Let's see the next one. Path processing, aggregate operations on an array. That's an important one, and nice to have separated out so that you can just take this chunk of code and really test it in a separate file if you need to. I skipped one of them because it was just too much to try to explain. We'll do the same thing for that. This is a good example. Being able to parse a date string. That's one of the features that we've got, numeric string parsing and date string parsing. Each one of those parsing functions is basically a subroutine. So it's a module that just got added in like that. So I can take that code and I can study it, improve it, test it, poke holes in it, anywhere else, and then plop it in here when I'm done. If I decide one day that, which I won't with this particular feature, but if I were to decide that the feature needed to be cut because it didn't really fit in with the function, it's as simple as removing this block of code. And at that point, I could get rid of this constant. But you can see it allows you to sort of plug and play the code a little bit better. So rather than thinking like, wow, this entire function is, so many thousands of lines of code, again, it's just a composite of a whole bunch of different functions put together into one file. Questions so far? Okay, I'm going to get to code minification. How good am I if I were to go over by about 10 minutes? Would that work out, or is that pushing it too much? Okay, well, I'll take that as a maybe. Code minification. This is one of the things that Jonathan mentioned to me that he thought people would be interested in hearing about. So here it is. We've got this sample, or we've got this source code that is 153,000 characters long, and we need to fit it into 30,000 characters. Originally, what I did with things like this was I used BBEdit, of course, and regular expressions to do things like remove the block comments and remove the double spaces and remove space after any particular line. And that was able to cut down the size of the code quite a bit. What I found, though, was eventually I was still squeezing too much in and had, I basically had a lot of code and not that much room. And I caught myself starting to cut corners. If you look at the version 16 source, you'll see some of these variable names are really not like, these are not variable names that I typically do. I don't do things like rpath, and yet I caught myself doing something like that for result path. I would actually prefer to have something that says result path there, or result path for type check. So I realized that I was starting to take too many shortcuts in my namings just so that I could make things small enough to fit in. And when I came to that realization, I decided I didn't want to do it. And so I wrote a calculation minifier. The calculation minifier is based upon a calculation parser that I had written. The calculation parser is written in JavaScript, and it basically takes a FileMaker calculation and parses it into tokens. So I'm going to take a calculation that's just sort of prefab in this web page here, and parse it, and I'll blow it up so that you can see it in a larger size here. It's basically taking that calculation and tokenizing it into all of its component parts. And I list them in my notes. It's easier to just see the list than it is for me to read them all here. All of these various types of tokens are what the parser identifies, breaks them out, returns it as JSON. And what that allows for the minifier to do is take that and filter out the things that we don't need. We don't need the comments. We don't need the white space. And then what we can do is we can map all of the variable names into smaller names. So I can start with my traditionally very long variable names, and they will appear in here. Let's find something. Here's a let variable right here. In the example, it was a short one, ironically enough. It can take a name like that and map it to something. In this case, it won't get any smaller, or maybe it gets smaller by one character, but map it to something that's going to be small. And so let's take a look at what that looks like. It's a calculation minifier. It looks like I was using it on JSONQuery itself. Let's go ahead and do that just for grins. We'll go back to the source code for version 18. We'll put it in here. And again, this was something like 150,000 characters or so. We'll minify it. We get it down here. And we're now down to just under 27,000 characters. It preserves, oh, this is interesting. This must be the currently released version of JSONQuery. I know that from just looking at this header. It preserves the top header. And everything else is the, the procedure that I mentioned. White space is removed, comments are removed. There is a flag that allowed me to preserve one particular variable name in there. If we look in the code, you'll see that max recursions had a special suffix that told the minifier to preserve that value, so that I wanted people to be able to come in here and see that it was here and adjust it as necessary if they felt that they needed to do so. So there's a special flag that I use to preserve that. Otherwise, everything else is minified and it fits into the custom function limit. So to answer the earlier question, part of the process, the workflow is to make very small changes, save that file, minify it, put it into FileMaker, test it out, and see what happens. And actually, one of the things that happens after that too, once I've got the change to a point where I've worked out the initial bugs, is to write a test case for it as well. And that's another thing we didn't get into with the maintainability, but part of the maintainability is writing a bunch of test cases, and this is an old version of JSONQuery. I kept that out there in case there was time to show you about some features that were cut, but we're not going to have time for that. So test cases, you write them to find the weak points of your function. You can see, like in here, some of my earliest test cases were about issues with new lines and line feeds, and let's see if I can find you one, with properly handling line feed characters and return characters. So I wrote a slew of test cases related to that. Anything that's going to be weak, or anything, of course, that's reported as a bug, you're writing a test case for it. That goes into the maintainability. I'm going to ask again, how are we doing on time? Because that'll determine what I dive into next. Okay, we're gonna try to.
Steve, this is
Yeah.
Beverly.
Hey,
A
Beverly.
quick question. Hey, long time no talk. You've got it all in one block of custom function, and for maintainability, the whole wax. How, if your code gets really big, how would it be if you had additional custom functions called with some of those routines, subroutines, so that you've got, just branch out to when you need it kind of thing, and then your initial code is only calling another custom function?
I think that's a great, that topic has come up a lot. Kevin has asked me if I was interested in doing that. Another person that I was discussing this with has asked the same thing. Yeah. I think it's a great idea for maintainability. I've always been attracted to the single custom function, just because one of the things that I always aspired to with anything that I wrote that I wanted to share was that it should be easy to add to a solution, and also easy to remove. That's the part that I think people don't think about quite as much. They say, oh, it was easy to add, but how many times do we go and open up somebody else's solution and you say, what's that code doing there? And they say, we're not sure if we're using it. And you say, well, then how come you haven't got rid of it? Well,
yeah, the dependencies is what I worry about if you have more than one routine.
Exactly.
Being a separate custom function. Okay,
so
thanks.
It's totally that balance though, because maintainability would totally dictate to factor it into several custom functions. Performance might not. Performance might dictate keeping it into one function and doing less factoring of code. Something kind of related to something that Corin was talking about last month, where he discovered sometimes you had to break the rules of normalization in order to keep performance happening. Same can kind of apply to the dry principle. There's the dry principle, and then what I call the opposite, the rye principle, repeat yourself everywhere. And you have to figure out where you're going to sit on that spectrum. I don't like moving away from dry, but I did try it in a couple of cases and I found performance tanked. And so I had to find certain compromises where I would repeat code that otherwise I would have liked to have factored out.
You run into also, if you had multiple custom functions, you run into the possibility that someone updates one of them and not realize that they need to update the other, and then you could be in a world of hurt because now you're dealing with just a weird scenario.
Absolutely. And part of what I wanted with this function was what I think of as like the swank hotel effect, where if you go to a hotel and everything's just like beautiful on the outside, everything seems perfect in place, And then sometimes you go behind the scenes, if you happen to be working there, and you realize that like what's under the hood is, you know, there's a lot of crazy stuff sometimes just to have that sort of amazing outer appearance. And it's not that I want to deceive anybody into thinking that the function is somehow, you know, a swank hotel, but basically I wanted the experience of using the custom function to be flawless for people. So that means all of the testing that I try to do, that means writing error statements that really tell you what you need to hone in on. If you put in bad error, it doesn't just, if garbage in gives you good error out, as opposed to gives you good error message out versus garbage in gives you garbage out. You know, I really wanted to be the sort of experience where people just used it and they didn't think about it because it just worked. And so that included installing and removing as well. So that, you know, that motivated a lot of that. I can see we're at time. There were a couple of the challenges that I wanted to talk about building this with respect to dealing with, you know, the FileMaker JSON functions. If we can spare maybe 5 more minutes, I'll do it. Otherwise,
absolutely, you can have up to 15 minutes.
Oh, awesome. Okay, great. Well, then let me just take a brief pause for a moment too, and ask if there are any questions before I move on, because maybe there's something more important that somebody wants to hear about or ask about.
I'm not sure this is important, but do you have a rough estimate of the person hours invested in this?
Oh, no idea. No idea. And that's, yeah, it's obviously a labor of love, right? There's, yeah, no estimate. Couldn't tell you. I didn't, you know, been working on it since version 16. So however many years that is, figure that I, you know, devoted many days out of each of those years. And here
like
it is.
Your passion project.
Actually, this is the second passion project. The other passion project had to take a back seat for a little while. So I'm excited that it's now coming back into the foreground again. But yeah, it's definitely passion driven.
Great.
Okay. So let's quickly see. We talked about devolution between 16 to 18 and while. We talked about code minification. And I'm sorry, I kind of drew up these notes and then I've kind of left them by the wayside. Let's take a look at a couple of the challenges that I came across when writing this. And again, you know, the objective was to write something, like I said a moment ago, that people would use and not really think about it because it would just work. And again, there was that concept of like, garbage in doesn't necessarily have to mean garbage out. If you can somehow make it be that somebody can give you something bad to work with and you can still turn a good result from it because you anticipated that, that's really going the extra distance that I was hoping to go. I won't say that I hit it all the time, but that's what I was striving for. So let's take a look at an example of that. Our first time we'll actually visit FileMaker and plop something in the data viewer. This calculation that I'm about to put in there, I'm basically supplying some JSON that has, it's an array, it's a string that is a JSON array, and that array contains 2 values. One value is, I'm going to blow this up a little bit because having had that conversation, maybe this will help. One value is a new line character, a line feed in particular. The escape sequence is \n for that, and that would be an ASCII 10. ASCII 13 is the carriage return. The escape sequence for that is \r. So that's legitimate JSON right there. It's been all extra escaped because it's a FileMaker string. But when we get that out and we get the first value and we take the code of it, we should see 10. And for the second character, we should see 13. 10 corresponding to the line feed and 13 corresponding to the carriage return. But when we put it in FileMaker, what we get, unless it's been fixed within like the last few days and I haven't updated or something like that, is, oh, I have it right here, great. Did some preparation. We get a 13 for both of those values. So what does that mean? That means that if somebody supplies legitimate JSON with line feeds encoded in it, and JSONQuery acts upon it, there's the danger that JSONQuery is going to miss a match because it was supposed to look for a return and it found a line feed, or vice versa. It was supposed to look for a line feed and it found a return, or it was returning values as return characters instead of line feed characters. Now, it's kind of an edge case, that's for sure. But again, with that ethic that you want people to be able to just have a seamless experience regardless of what you've been handed, I decided that I wanted the code to be able to detect when line feeds were there and specially protect them so that it wouldn't just return a 13 or a 13, it would return the right thing. Now, of course, downstream from that, it's quite possible that some FileMaker code would go and take that line feed character and turn it into a return 2 lines later in a script or something like that. There's nothing I can do about that, but to the extent that I could protect this sort of situation within the custom function, I decided to do so. Incidentally, this isn't limited just to line feed. There's also a paragraph separator character and a line separator character. And that's why I asked if Mark was here earlier. Mark Scott was the one who called those particular anomalies to my attention several years ago now. So the deal is, what are we going to do with patching this up? The second, I'm going to show both of the solutions at once. So I'm going to show the other quandary right now, which is determining the node type of a value within JSON. So in this case, this is a JSON string that represents an array, or it's a FileMaker string that represents JSON, a JSON array that's got a few different values in it. And I'll just plop this into the data viewer because I think it'll be easier to see there. But the thing that I'm trying to show is that when you extract these values from the array, you can see the very first thing that I'm showing here is in the result of the data viewer is just the JSON itself. So you can see what we've got here. We've got basically an object, an array, a number, a Boolean, an empty string, a null, a populated string, a string that happens to look like an object, and a string that happens to look like an array. Now, when you pull them all out of the JSON using JSON get element, you cannot distinguish the string that looks like an object from an actual object, nor can you distinguish the string that looks like an array from an actual array. So if you were thinking that you would be able to determine the type of a node by simply looking at the first character when you pull it out, you could, you basically are opening up the door to having an error in your code, because you'll be mistaken in cases where you have something like this, where it happens to be a string, but the string just happens to be a string representing a well-formed JSON object or JSON array. So you need some sort of method to be able to detect node type. And when I say you need, basically what I mean is JSONQuery needed that in the first place. It needed the ability to know whether it was dealing with an array or an object so that it could branch accordingly within its code, and so that it could offer some of the features that it did that distinguished between those values. And I needed a way to do that. So let's take a look at the solutions for those 2 questions. Again, question number 1 was, how do we deal with the ambiguity between extracting a line feed versus extracting a return character? And then question 2 was, how do we determine the data type of an arbitrary node within some supplied JSON? And I will say arbitrary supplied JSON. So first topic, preserving the line feeds. It's basically as simple as doing substitutions. So the order of operations is you take your JSON, and anywhere that there's a line feed in it or an escaped version of the line feed, you substitute that value with something else. And then you go ahead and extract your value as needed, or you do all of your processing. And at the end, before you return your result, you reverse the escaping that you did. So I put the basic steps right here. I think I might have shown substitution. Yeah, let's look at the actual code. I think that'll be better than looking at the steps that I itemized. So substitution example. This is actually an excerpt from JSONQuery that I just threw into a simple calculation. Again, it's because JSONQuery has that modular approach. It was pretty much almost as simple as just pulling out that one block of code and putting it in here so we could take a look at it. We've got the sample JSON that we were looking at earlier with the line feed and the return. Again, I defined my constants at the top, and I've defined all of the things that I'm going to need to escape, and also the escape character that I'm going to use, and the escape sequences that I'm going to use to replace them. And then in the next couple of lines that actually do anything, we're basically looking at substituting the values that need to be escaped. You can see first off, I'm protecting the escape character itself, so that if it appears anywhere in the input string, it won't be harmed. Similar protection is being taken for the backslash character. And then I'm moving on to the characters that I need to protect, which are the line separators and the paragraph separators. And it looks like I'm going to get to the new line and the line feed later. I won't go into why I do that at this point. Actually, no, I take that back. This looks like when I made this example, it looks like I did something that I didn't need to do. I could have probably just put those up there. So take back what I said a second ago. It's an artifact of how I created this example. But the point is, the output that you get has those values protected. And I think I put that into the data viewer so we can see it. So let's have a look at that. There we go. So this is that same calculation we we're just looking at. And in the output, you can see the new line has been escaped and the return character has been escaped with escape sequences, such that if we do some sort of processing of this and we count them or return them or we search on them or whatever we do to them, we return them at the very end. All that I have to do is to replace the escape sequence with the original character, and the JSON has then preserved the character that otherwise would have been harmed by the use of JSON get element. So it's basically an escape sequence and a substitution to the rescue. So nothing fancy. I mean, we all use substitute all the time, right? It's just the strategy that you use and being aware of the situation and then knowing how to, the steps that you need to take in the proper sequence to be able to protect against the value getting munched, if you will. So the more elaborate example, solving the node type puzzle. This one here, this one took a little time for me to solve, and it's only one of, I think there are multiple possible solutions, and I actually know that there are because Alex Suyev, he's written a custom function that he actually published to do this. I took a look at it, and it has Alex's signature brilliance and intelligence all over it. I totally would recommend it to anyone. At the time when I was writing JSONQuery, I was basically in my own little silo, and I'm not sure whether that custom function actually existed, but I came up with a different way, which again involves substitutions. So what we're doing is, remember, we have to find some way to be able to detect the difference between a string that appears to be a JSON object versus an actual JSON object. And then we want to also be able to distinguish between things like the null and the empty string, or say false and a 0, or true and a 0. So let's jump right into the code because we have just a few minutes left here. Here's the substitution code. Again, while we're scrolled out, you can see it's got the same sort of signature organizational pattern that I use, constants at the top. In this case, I've even broken out my constants into sections by category, and they're all uppercase per my convention. Then get the input. So I guess I swapped around my order. In this case, I got the input after the constants. Let's take a look at this. This is the actual part of the code that does the work that we need to do. Basically, we're going to take that input JSON and we're going to run more escapes on it. We're going to find any instance of the word null and replace it with something special. Same with true, replace it with something special. False, the same. And 2 quote characters in a row are going to be replaced with something special. Now, what that means is that later on, if you want to know the data type of some particular path, as long as you've processed that path with the same sort of processing that you've processed to this entire JSON that we're doing here, you can follow that path, extract the value, and if the value happens to equal this, you'll know that it's a Boolean false rather than the number 0. Or if you get this, you'll know it's a Boolean true rather than the number 1. Or if you get this, you'll know that it's an actual null value versus an empty string, and vice versa for this, an empty string rather than a null value. Similarly, in this substitution, we're taking the quotes, and I'm sort of skimming over a couple of the details because there's actually some additional escaping that has to go on before you can do this next step. But what we're doing is we're placing what I call a quote marker next to the quote characters, so that if you've got a quoted string in your JSON, so you're just looking at something like this, a string, Fred, right? We're going to substitute it such that there's an inner quote marker right there and right there. And when we extract that value out, we'll be able to know that it's a string by virtue of the fact that character 1 is going to be this special character. Now, it so happens that that special character has to be a white space character because we're going to wind up basically bookending our quote characters like this, and we don't want it to break our JSON. So if our JSON looks something like this, we're going to have a JSON object with a:\Fred. Let's say this is our original JSON. We sneak in these extra characters here where it doesn't matter, here where it doesn't matter, or where it does matter, here where it matters, and here where it doesn't. We'll be able to select this out and know that it's a string because it's got that inner quote marker in there. That's what allows us to detect the strings. Let's go back to the rest of the code and you can kind of see big picture what's going on. We've done these escapes. We've injected the type check markers, I think. Oh, into the path. Okay, so this is where we're injecting all of the special characters and markers into the actual JSON. We do the same thing to the path because you have to process the path the same way you process the JSON so that all of the substitutions will line up. And then from there, you just grab the value. You grab the value, target value is equal to your escape JSON, get the value at the path that's been escaped. And from there, you do a simple comparison to determine what type it is. JSON is invalid would be something determined up at the top of this function, but after that, you're just looking if the target value equals your particular escape sequences that you've set, then you know whether it's a null, Boolean, string, so on and so forth. If it happens to have an inner quote marker, you know it's a string. And then if it doesn't have the inner quote marker, then you can do one of these tests to see whether it's a JSON object or array. Last thing I'll say about this is you have to take care in how you define these escape sequences. You'll notice that they're all numbers, and that's just so that you can swap them in for something like the word null. If you swap in the word null with 92, that's not going to break your JSON, versus if you happen to have something, let's say this had been null. Say we had this, and if I had another value here that was null, and I thought I could just come in and swap this with something like Fred, what would happen is this would also come in here and swap as Fred, and that sequence of quotes would break my JSON. So basically the escape sequences that I chose for this sort of thing had to be numbers so that this would come in here and still be preserved as valid JSON, and this would be escaped as the node type that we want. Thanks for the extra time. I know we're at time, and I'm sorry I had to rush a lot, but
we would like to thank you for both your passion and your detail orientation, which must be awesome. Are there any final questions? If not, Jonathan Reff is going to be organizing the March meeting, and he'd like a couple seconds.
Sure. So first of all, 3 great presentations today, thanks to the presenters. And we have some space, some time available for next month's meeting. So if any of you out there are watching and saying, gosh, I got something I'd like to share with the group, please contact me. I'll put my email address in the chat in a second. And it could be a short, just like a little tip or trick, 5 or 10 minute thing, or it could be a longer presentation if there's something more in depth you want to share. But please reach out if you've got something you want to share with the group. Thanks, Layne.
Okay, and thank you, Steve. That was wonderful. It gave us a lot better underpinning of I think confidence if we're working with the JSON query, because it kind of demystifies a lot of it. So thank you very much, and thank you for everyone who attended today. We'll see you next month on March 11th.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Lynn. Good to see everybody.
Yeah, good to see y'all.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Lynn.